What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Templar Healer. So the Templar Healer still remains one of the stronger healing classes in the game, right up there with Wardens, and they are still the staple healer in 4-man content and in 12-man content. For 12-man content, obviously you have 2 healer spots. One of them is usually going to be a Templar, and that's just because Templars provide a lot of utility to the group, mainly through the use of several unique synergies that kind of help the group out maintaining their Lakestes uptime as well as Alkosh uptimes as well. So Templar healers, you guys are still in fashion, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. So, like our previous build videos with the DPS, we will just be going over skills, and because we don't really have a parse or rotation to talk about, instead we'll be talking about kind of the philosophy behind healing, my personal take on healing, and how to really approach healing as an endgame, a 12-man content kind of healer. And I'll also provide some links in the description below to people who actually do main healers in endgame content. I do not main a healer, and while I am knowledgeable enough to get by, I am not exactly the best healer in the game, so I do highly recommend you check out the content creators that I have in the description below if you guys have any more detailed questions about healing. So let's go ahead and get started here. Again, we will not be going over gear in this video. That is on a separate video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right now. If you are interested in the gear sets that you want to run as a healer, pause this video, go ahead and take a look at that video up there, and then come back here when you are ready to move on to skills and kind of the philosophy behind healing. So in terms of skills, starting off with our front bar here, this is mainly generic skills, although there is one flex spot here that you can kind of swap certain skills out for. You have Illustrious Healing. You can also go with the other morph, which is Healing Springs, although Illustrious Healing is generally regarded to be the better morph. Radiant Regeneration, this is the flex skill that I was talking about earlier. You can swap this out with a different skill if need be. Combat Prayer, the staple here. Power of the Light. If you have a Stamina Templar in group, you won't need to run Power of the Light, but not a lot of groups will be running Stamina Templars, so you should be running this skill here for the Minor Fracture, Minor Breach. And of course, you have Energy Orb for the Combustion as well as the Heal. For our ultimate on our front bar here, we have Solar Prison, but you do have a couple of options when it comes to ultimates, and we'll be going over those in a few minutes. For our back bar, this is the Lightning Staff bar. We have Elemental Drain. Now, in theory, only one healer will need to run this, depending on how many bosses and how many things you have to Ele Drain. Sometimes both healers will run this, but in theory, only one healer will have to run this. So if you don't need to run Elemental Drain, you have another bar slot here that you can play around with. You have Blockade of Storms to help proc your enchants. Extended Ritual, this is the Templar's unique synergy, Purify, which activates Lakestes, activates Alkosh. It also serves as a heal as well as a cleanse, so really nice ability here. Channeled Focus, if you don't need a sustain, you don't need to run Channeled Focus. This is nice, not just for the sustain, but also for the major ward, major resolve. I guess major resolve at this point for the additional resistances. So really helpful here to help out survivability. It does give you some additional sustain, so if you don't need a sustain, you can always swap this skill out, but I would recommend keeping this just for the major resolve. And then finally we have Luminous Shards here for the additional synergy. This is a little bit different from the synergy from Orbs. They share the same cooldown, but Shards is more immediate, and it also returns, at the very least, Luminous Shards return some additional secondary resources as well. Then obviously we have Aggressive Warhorn for our ultimate here. So in terms of other abilities you're going to want to run here, just going down the line really fast. Under the Dawn's Wrath line, Solar Prison, I want to talk about this ultimate really quickly here. So Solar Prison, you won't really see this being used too much in progression groups. The main reason you'll be running Solar Prison is for the Major Maim. It's one of the only sources of Major Maim in the game, and it lasts for quite a while. As you can see here, 10 seconds. You're mainly going to be using this in one of 2 scenarios. First one is where you might need some additional AoE damage. Now, there are other ultimates you could run, like the Desert Staff ultimate, which would be a little bit stronger. But this is a pretty decent ultimate for you to use in AoE fights, especially in trash fights where you kind of want to maintain survivability but not give up too much damage. The other kind of scenario you'd be running Solar Prison is really just any sort of execute high damage phases. A hard mode, you have Halt's Fabrication, the last boss, execute. Those would be instances where you might run Solar Prison. But for kind of endgame groups, the score pushers, you're not really going to be seeing this run too often. Another restoring light skills line, you have a few options here. The first ability you're going to want to take note of here is going to be Breath of Life or Honor of the Dead. This is sort of a burst heal, pretty strong. Breath of Life also heals one other person, so it is pretty nice here, sort of a kind of an AoE heal, but not really. It does have a conal in front of you, so you can't heal anybody behind you with it. Honor of the Dead just gives you some additional Magicka back if you're healing somebody below 75% health. The other burst heal would be Ritual of Rebirth, which costs more compared to any of the morphs of Rushed Ceremony, but it is an AoE heal, so it heals for more people. Ritual of Rebirth is the morph that I prefer, but you can also run Hasty Prayer as well for additional wider expedition. Ritual Rebirth will heal somebody outside of the radius, one person, for basically the same amount of health, so always really nice to have that there. I had the opposite morph here, but you can also run Radiant Aura if you just want the minor Magicka steal and you don't need the major breach from Ellie Drain. So this could be useful if you just want to apply minor Magicka steal across a lot of different enemies, but it's generally speaking not something you will be seeing run too often in boss fights. And obviously you have Extended Ritual and Channel Focus, we've already talked about those. Now under the Restless Staff line, one ability that you're going to want to potentially pick up is going to be Healing Ward. If you're running the Blackrose Prison Restoration Staff on the front bar, obviously you're going to want to run this ability in order to make use of that staff. Pretty decent, not quite as strong of a burst heal compared to something like a Ritual of Rebirth or Breath of Life, but still potentially useful when combined with the Blackrose Prison Staff to get that Major Vitality. So you can't really apply Major Vitality with any of your Templar skills, so that's probably the best way to apply it outside of wearing some other sets or your DPS or tanks running some other abilities there. You also might want to run Quick Siphon, which grants minor lifesteal, which is pretty decent, but it's kind of outclassed by Overflowing Altar, which we'll talk about in a little bit here in terms of application of minor lifesteal. Siphon Spirit is another potential option here, which applies both lifesteal and Magicka steal. So pretty good if you don't want to run Ellie Drain or Overflowing Altar. That way you can get both the minor lifesteal and the minor Magicka steal with just one ability. But you will not be able to get the Overflowing Altar synergy. Ellie Drain, you won't necessarily get the Major Breach if that's important. So just keep that in mind here if you do want to run these two abilities. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that this has to be on the Resto Staff bar. So if you don't have space in your bar, obviously you can't run this on a Destro Staff bar. So you got to keep that in mind as well. Destro Staff line, not much else to talk about. A lot of the other abilities here are mostly for kind of this off DPS healer role, which most groups will not really be running too much. If you ever need a shield, even though Templars do have a shield and Radiant Ward, Harness Magicka and Dampen Magic are going to be stronger shields for healers. So if you need a shield, run one of these two morphs. Doesn't really matter which one you pick here. Next, let's see here, where is it? The Deciduous Order line. Mend Wound, either morph, Mend Spirit, or Symbiosis. This is an interesting ability here, and it does have the potential to give you the highest healing per second done on a single target, if you're able to channel that heavy attack. It is useful in certain niche scenarios, but it's not really going to be an ability that you're going to be running very often. Essentially acts as a toggle ability, so once you activate it, it replaces your light attacks and heavy attacks with a healing move here. One potential use of Mend Wound you could use if you're not really concerned about damage output would be if you're combining this with Hollow Fang's Thirst, which is a set that returns Magicka back whenever you heal or damage an enemy. If you're running Mend Wounds, you will only ever heal enemies, so that means the Hollow Fang's Thirst proc will always land on your allies, which is obviously very beneficial in certain fights. So that's one niche use of Mend Wounds that might be justified if you're not interested in dealing DPS. However, always a little bit DPS is always more beneficial, so just keep that in mind before you decide to run this ability here. And at the Undaunted line, you're going to want to have all these abilities unlocked. So for Blood Altar, go with the Overflowing Altar morph for the stronger Blood Feast synergy. Shadow Silk is not quite as strong of a synergy as it used to be before it was nerfed, but it's still a potentially good move to run if you have a lot of stamina DPS. There are going to be some fights where you're going to need to taunt things, so you're going to want to have Inner Rage on hand. You have Bone Surge here for the Major Vitality buff that it provides with the synergy. So really strong buff here with the Major Vitality, especially in fights like Cloud Rest, where you have to combat Baneful Mark and Execute. Just makes healing everybody back up a little bit faster that way. And obviously Energy Orb for the heal and the combustion synergy. Then under the Undaunted, I should say, Alliance Warline, one ultimate you could run is going to be Reviving Barrier. This gives you, if you have access to the passive Magicka Aid, up to 10% additional Magicka regen if you have it slotted here. The shield is also very strong as well, so it's really good ability here, really good ultimate to kind of improve overall group survivability. You can hit 12 people with it, so you could hit the entire raid group with this gigantic shield. The heal is also pretty strong as well. Then if you need a group Purge, you can run Efficient Purge. Even though Extended Ritual does have the Purify synergy, it's a synergy, so it has a 20-second cooldown. So you will need to run Purge in some fights in order to cleanse any sort of negative debuffs. So just keep that in mind here. And that is pretty much all different abilities that you're going to want to run. In terms of abilities, you definitely need to keep on your bars. Illustrious Healing is definitely one. Calmet Prayer for the Minor Berserk. Power of the Light if you don't have a Templar for the Minor Fracture, Minor Breach. Heal Energy Orb for the healing and the combustion synergy. On the back bar, Blockade of Storms for the enchant proc chance. Extended Ritual for the healing as well as the Purify synergy. And Luminous Shards just for the quick, immediate resources back, especially if you kind of have groups that are kind of separated out. It's very common in trials to have a group DPS group up and then tanks group up. So having the shard, being able to send out the resource right away to the tank instead of having for the tank to wait for the orb to get to them is pretty beneficial as well. Then obviously for ultimate, Warhorn is the ultimate you want to keep, but you don't necessarily need to double bar it, so you can always use one of the other two ultimates on either of your bars here, depending on kind of where you want to put your aggressive Warhorn. That's pretty much all the skill stuff. So in terms of the philosophy behind healing in ESO, it's a little bit different compared to some other MMOs that you guys might have played before. So in ESO, the job of a healer is more of a DPS support role. So you are doing a little bit of DPS on the side here. If you're running something like Zens, you are obviously going to want some dots. So you might be running things like Degeneration, you might be running Vampire's Bane, for example, Soul Trap. So you're providing some additional DPS that way, along with the additional damage taken debuff from Zens. So that's one way you can contribute to this sort of DPS support role, but your main sort of goal here is to basically improve overall DPS as best as you can, as much as you can. And that's going to be through a couple of different things. So first off is obviously going to be buffs you can provide. So that would be things like Minor Berserk, which hopes increase damage done. And then obviously you have debuffs like Minor Vulnerability through sets like IA, or maybe some your other healer, for example, a Warden healer might be able to apply it through Fetch Infection instead, or you have a Nightblade tank that's running Teleport Strike that's able to apply Minor Vulnerability that way. So buffs and debuffs are pretty important here. Minor Fracture, Minor Breach helps improve DPS, and so on and so forth. Third way you can help out DPS support would be to provide additional synergies. That's one of the reasons why Templars are one of the better classes to play as a healer, because you have unique synergies that are not available on other classes. Some synergies are shared across classes. So for example, Energy Orb, the Combustion synergy, every class is able to access that. But the Purify synergy on Extended Ritual is only available to Templars. And so the extra unique synergy will help stamina DPS running Lachesis to get better Lachesis uptime, as well as it help improve Alkosh uptimes on the tanks as well. So those are a couple of ways that help kind of support your DPS, support your tanks. So it's not just all about raw healing, it's not just about healing done per second, it's all about debuff and debuff uptimes as well. The hallmark of a good healer is not just being able to keep everybody alive, but keep everybody alive and maintain very good buff and debuff uptimes at the same time. Overhealing in this game is pretty easy to do, so the actual job of keeping everybody alive is actually pretty easy to do. And so healers, if you are going to go into 12-man endgame content, I would focus more on trying to maintain buffs and debuffs, making sure orbs are out at all times in order to help give out combustion synergies, and so on, to help support your DPS, because that is really what raid leads are looking for when they're looking at support roles to take into their teams, what is their reputation for maintaining buffs and debuffs on either metrics reports or on ESO logs. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I am not a primary healer. I heal occasionally, but it's not my primary role. In the description below, you will find links to a couple of healer mains who will be better able to answer any sort of detailed questions you might have concerning healing. So for me personally, my sort of approach to healing is really still just sort of focusing on buffs and debuffs and using my healing over time abilities to kind of take care of everybody in terms of actual healing output. So for example, I personally try to maintain, keep a very close eye on block aid, power of the lights, combat prayer, and energy orbs. Those are the 4 abilities that I try to keep a good eye on, try to maintain 100% uptime on. And of course, I will throw down my heal over time abilities, so radiant regeneration, illustrious healing. Energy orb is already a very strong heal over time, and that'll usually be able to cover me in terms of the amount of healing I have to do. Obviously, if I need to burst heal, then I'll use combat prayer, I'll use ritual of rebirth if I need it, if I have it on, help the burst healing out, but generally speaking, heal over times are usually enough, and that allows me to focus more on buffs and debuffs. So for example, block aid helps me maintain my concussion up times with my shock damage enchant to help off balance uptime. So a lot of it is just gonna be starting to learn how to keep an eye on all your buffs and debuffs. So I do recommend picking up something like Strendar, action duration reminder, raid buffs, in order to really keep track of all these buffs. Well, that concludes this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. But again, I do have links to healer mains, so you can ask them on their Twitch chats or their YouTube channels for any sort of more detailed advice as well. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.